Alright YouTube, it's time to talk about the movement of the left versus the movement of the right over the last decade, especially as we've undergone this sort of mostly now paradigm shift. It's ongoing, it's not complete yet, and it's sort of, it starts at different times and to different magnitudes on these two sides. The left began its transformation earlier, but moves more slowly. The right began it only a few years ago. And then the shift took hold in full sway, and it's half done already. The left today, so-called, that is, this sort of rough alliance of partisan Democrats, progressives, and corporate liberals, so-called, along with some of the old guard liberals that are certainly unionists and so forth, have actually become a lot like the old right. They've embraced moralism. And we see now increasingly they're embracing religiosity as well. Because of the Islam question, as well as the what does Christ represent sort of interpretation of Western Christianity, they've actually adopted a very especially pro-Catholic stance. They like the Pope, generally. Even though he's pissed them off with his talk regarding transgendered individuals. He pissed them off then. But his early statements about, who am I to judge in regards to like gay marriage, his suggestion that, contraception at least is preferable to spreading STDs around and stuff, has really endeared himself to a lot of the Democrats in this country, the so-called left, as well as some of the progressives. I'm not sure why, because it's basically like the Catholic Church deciding to leave the 1800s behind and step into the early 1900s. I guess that's their idea of progress or something like that. Not exactly sure what they're getting at, but they've done it nonetheless. But the left increasingly is the party of moralism. Now, we haven't seen this. We haven't seen sort of the Democrats and pro-post-federalist sort of groups, those that want increasing and big government. They pretend they want it for social progress. It's really about more control, more centrality in the government. We haven't seen the sort of fusion that we're seeing now since the Temperance era. In the Temperance era, if you don't know anything about the history of that time period, who was pushing prohibition? Who were the people pushing the moral laws in that time period? One was the clergy. The clergy pushed them because they saw it as a social ill. Scientists pushed it. The early eugenics and pre-eugenics, the scientists, in fact, a lot of the people pushing like anti-abortion laws at the time, believe it or not, were doctors. They were tired of performing them, essentially. They were tired of the fact that back then it was primitive and a lot of people died on the slab, so to speak, so they were part of that as well. And feminists, suffragettes, early wave feminists were part of this general movement. Give the government more power. They didn't want their husbands or boyfriends to chew tobacco, to drink. They wanted them to be clean-shaven and have the nice job and to care for them and pamper them and so forth. To be upstanding Christian men. And it fused religion with what they felt was social progress into one. It meshed them together as part of a general leftist social movement. I think people who look at evangelism, they forget that the early fire and brimstone evangelists on this side of the Atlantic Ocean were really a bunch of liberals. They had nothing to do with this fake conservatism like the neocon era. That's all corporatism once the church becomes a big business, essentially. Before that, all the stump preachers were talking about the government should be empowered to ban alcohol. The government should be empowered to ban drugs. The government should also be empowered to encourage the suffragette movement. I guess their idea was that if women could have jobs, own property and stuff, they could pay tithes too. And they saw men, the sort of wild men of the late 1800s, the tobacco-chewing, drinking men, as less likely to contribute. They figured, well, if we let these women clean their men up, their men will work harder, make more money, they'll tithe more, they'll go to church, they'll be more moralistic in their sentiments. And so everything will just sort of work out on the monetary end for us. The society, the sidewalks will be cleaner and people's clothes will be cleaner. Stuff like that. It'll be a nicer society, a more polite society. Didn't quite work out that way, but that was the general thinking at the time. We see the same thing now happening today. The left increasingly has, for example, other than on marijuana, it's abandoned opposition to the drug war, which was sort of the far left sentiment. Well, why should the government be empowered to ban any of these substances? They're ruining people's lives. They still talk about the private prison complex, but they're not willing to address the central issue there of why the prisons are overcrowded. The corporations that are involved with that complex, they fund Democrats too, and in fact they fund outright progressives often, because they realize if they make that switch, if they get away from throwing potheads in jail, who are they going to throw in jail to be slave labor next? The next wave of slave labor, maybe it's people who are bigoted or intolerant or something like that. They have the wrong views, they have wrong think, or something along those lines. Essentially, I think what their plan is. But we see third wave feminists have now amalgamated together with post-hippie leftists, with sort of the corporate left, as well as with religious leaders, both in Islam and Catholicism. Not so much the Protestant faith, and kind of Judaism, but really on the left you're getting more secular Jewish individuals, and the orthodoxies, like some of them are such hardcore conservatives, but also pacifistic, oddly enough in some cases. Such hardcore conservatives are like, no, leave us alone. We don't just want a Trump wall, we want like 5 Trump walls or something like that. And we want 10 more of them in Israel. It's like totally insular, total isolationism or something like that. Makes no sense on that end either, I'll have to say in all honesty, in my opinion. But the left is fusing the same groups that it used during the Temperance movement. It's attempting to enforce moralism. The moralism has simply changed. It's embraced religion. It's just the religious sort of groups happen to be different. The Catholics weren't the ones driving temperance. It was the Protestants. Now the Protestants are rock-ribbed conservatives. They don't believe in that necessarily. Supposedly want to scale back government. Some of them do. Some of them just want to maintain it at its already bloated level. The moralism, though, now is coming from the left. Even a couple of decades ago, I was aware of the world at the time. Moralism came from the right wing, saying we need to ban gay marriage and gay behavior. We need to ban these atheists from holding public office. We need to ban people from having anything other than a Christian nativity. We need to force businesses to say Merry Christmas instead of Happy Holidays. We need to keep drugs illegal, probably make them more illegal, and all of these things, all of these moral laws that were designed to enforce sort of what they felt was a proper reigning American culture, they came from the right wing. Now, though, in the age of social media, the left got left behind. They're now the regressives. They're now technically conservatives after the fashion that they cast, older, the neocons for decades. Under the same sort of principles they labeled them, they now shall be labeled. They're the old guard now, and they've become the moralists. They just happen to disagree on what American culture represents. Their idea of Americana, of moralism, is we're open to everyone, we're a melting pot with open borders. No intolerance whatsoever, ideological intolerance, legal intolerance, social intolerance, doesn't matter. It has to be at least cracked down on in the moral sense. If not outright banned, we should probably drag people to prison for wrongthink or something like that. I find myself increasingly solely targeting the left, not because I changed my ideologies, but because the left became the new moralists. This rise of the new right is not predicated on a bunch of people getting together and deciding that neoconservatism was cool, or that the Republican Party was cool. It's because the left are the ones that want to censor online speech, largely. There are right-wing groups that want to do that too, and certainly neocons, which are the same thing as the neoliberals, sort of a crossover centrist group of sorts, corporatists. The left are the ones that want to censor that want to regulate online speech, centralize it, make it easier for governments to slap down critics, make it easier for social progressives to promulgate their material in a vacuum, in an echo chamber. They're the ones that now go after the drugs increasingly. We see there are now a few so-called right-wingers, somebody like Rand Paul, that are actually considered fringe even among the Democrats on these issues. He's like, oh, well, we should just decriminalize all these substances, let the states handle it, and maybe just not even let that happen, just let people handle it on their own as individuals. And even the Democrats are like astonished at this. Oh, society will fall apart. They're the ones that now invoke Jesus more than the right wing did. The right wing maybe 10 years ago, it was Jesus this, Jesus that, oh, these atheists, it's a problem, all these other groups, it's a problem, we're a Christian nation, blah, 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 blah. Now it's the left doing that. Jesus was a refugee. Jesus was a foreigner. Jesus would have loved the poor enough to give them welfare at the state level somehow, or something like that. He actually liked, according to the myth, he liked private charity, not state charity, but it's a different issue entirely. So they're the ones that invoke Jesus and Allah and what the Pope said yesterday and stuff like that. They're the ones now that want men to clean up their act. Again, Temperance era. A bunch of liberals and feminists get together to tell men how they should and should not act. You shouldn't be chewing tobacco. You shouldn't be drinking. Shave your friggin' beard. Shave your long hair. We want manliness to be short hair and a smooth face, and an extreme ascetic lifestyle and celibacy before marriage and all of these other things. And you're going to provide for your woman, and you're going to give 10% to the church, and you're going to be an upstanding Christian citizen. Now they've redesigned what it means to be manly again. Now they say, it's actually, you should be proud to be a literal cuck. This is actually a thing among some of the far left. Oh, I'm a proud cuck. It's a good thing. It's the intellectual fetish or something like that, they say. Men should be silent, more or less, on a variety of social issues. They should feel guilty. They're responsible for many things. And before, where the left on the race issue said, black people, and we've got the race question. Steiner touched on this not long after sort of the temperance era begins into the literal prohibition era. Steiner weighed in, said, we need to answer the race question, and the cult was totally overlapped with this, but spirituality was heavily intertwined with what went on. It is today as well in the new wave of moralism on the left. That's why they're invoking Jesus all the time, or talking about Wicca or to save the whales sort of stuff. They said we need to solve the race question. And back then, that question to them was, how are we reconciling the actions of groups outside of European diaspora? Now the race question of the left, in association with the same religious zealots and the same feminists that were around a century ago, their new race question is, what do we do about toxic masculinity and specifically in relation to white males or something like that? It's the same thing. If you've studied history, then you know exactly what's happening right now. If you've studied the Temperance era, not even in any degree of depth, it'd take you an afternoon to read up all about these things. You'd find, much to your astonishment, that virtually everything that's happening right now among the social justice warrior elements of the left, in partnership with their chosen religious figures, in partnership with the corporations, the moneyed folks that back their campaigns and their activism so-called and stuff, it's an exact doppelganger of everything that happened during the Temperance era. History is literally repeating itself. And into this sort of equivalent of the 1910s, 1920s period, you're also getting a right wing that is beginning to now encroach upon Calvin Coolidgedom and begin actually attempting to reign in government. And we probably will thus, because everything else is fucking repeating itself. We see the same situation in Europe that we saw at the time. We see the same social alienation. We see ethnic alienation, we see political alienation, religious alienation, and everything else under the sun. It's almost looking a little bit like sort of the modern art, is sort of late 1910s into flapper period there as well. People are talking about decadence, people are talking about degeneracy. It's exactly the same. We're locked in some weird fusion of the 1910s through the early 1930s right now. When we look at Europe and the political movements rising up there, they're almost invariably, the center's collapsing everywhere in Europe. Just like it did in the late 20s through the 1930s, before the Second World War, before the true wave of eugenics, the late stage began. Everything's the same. It's we're on repeat, we're looping around, we just have different technology this time. Everything is the same as in that period. Here in the United States and over in Europe, it's the same in Asia too. The rise of some of these movements are beginning to, astonishingly, resemble the same thing that happened before. Look at what Duterte is doing in the Philippines. And some of the nationalistic style of movements there, as people tried to approximate the outside world that they had just encountered, the Europeans and stuff, to try to safeguard their cultures, they're adopting the same methods that they did 100 years ago. It's the same thing. And the left is doing the same thing here that it did before. Now, long term, does it succeed? The temperance movement technically succeeded and very quickly burned itself out because it was quickly realized it didn't solve drunkenness, and it was vastly unpopular with people who did want to have the occasional drink. People started fighting against it almost as soon as Prohibition was passed, and it didn't last very long. The drug war was a more long-term, tangible impact of that as they began banning various substances. Of course, with the reefer madness sort of propaganda. I wouldn't be surprised if that comes back too. We do see it. We see the propaganda now regarding this, like the third-hand smoke and stuff like that with tobacco could roughly be seen to approximate sort of the reefer madness stuff of the 1910s and 1920s. It could be seen to approximate that. Are we headed for another world war then in another decade or two? There are plenty of people who think that that actually is a possibility. You look at the situation between the U.S. and Russia. Yeah, it could happen. Only this time around we have nuclear weapons, so it'd be a little bit more dangerous now, wouldn't it? Hopefully the presence of MAD holds this off into proxy war territory instead of direct conflict. So yeah, a lot of people suffer and die, but the entire world isn't destroyed. But then again, there are people who think that that's the only solution. We're repeating ourselves. We're somewhere in the 1910s through the 1930s. It's impossible to put a specific date on what we're exactly repeating. But the actions of the left here, and the far left and so-called far right in Europe, where the center collapses just like it did in the Weimar days before, of course, you have essentially two main parties, the Nazis and the Communists, fighting for control. How many more coincidental similarities do we need before we declare that we're in that period of time? Even the styles look similar. A few years ago, I was in a store. I can't remember which specific store it was. Yeah, I think it was when I was in Texas. I looked at the clothing, I'm like, this looks like stuff that people were wearing in like the late 20s or into the early days of the Great Depression. What the hell am I looking at? This doesn't look normal to me. Now we look around, and yeah, indeed, it's still happening. People are borrowing from the past. The left is borrowing its ideology right now that it's using. The social justice warriors don't even realize their ideology is a century old. The fusion model that they're creating in their sort of overarching social system that they're trying to use to suppress opinions that they disagree with is essentially the same as what people were doing multiple generations ago, around the time of the First World War, or thereabouts. We could say that we're kind of in a world war right now. You look at the situation in the Middle East. Is it dicey enough with enough foreign powers involved that it kind of approximates that on a regional scale? Hell of a lot of refugees pouring out of these regions, so maybe that began around the time of 9/11 or thereabouts when we started invading. Now Russia and China are involved, all these other states, the European powers are involved. Looks like a world war to me, just one that's more limited because nobody wants to deploy their nukes or something like that. They don't want to directly attack one another for their differences because they know it'll begin ending the world. But yeah, the left have adopted basically the temperance movement. They're trying to tell men how to live. They're increasingly, they're more and more religious or spiritual, you could say. They're certainly more moralistic over time. They've dropped most of the social progressivism in favor of just advocating more statism. Every single hallmark that could possibly be said about, again, sort of the pre-prohibition era. That's about all. Peace out.